Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And I'm excited this week because we've got a really different topic. I'm talking today to Matthew Adam, and he's going to explain what a systemic psychotherapist is and how it links to leadership, amongst other things. So Matthew, would you like to introduce yourself to our audience? Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yes. Hi, Lucinda. Thanks for having me. As you said, I'm a systemic psychotherapist, but I'm also an organizational consultant and coach. But my background is in systemic psychotherapy. And systemic psychotherapy is really about relationships. It's about how do we understand the interconnected nature of the elements that comprise a system and how they interact with each other effectively or ineffectively. And thinking about how can you improve that system so that it operates more functionally. An easy way to think about systemic thinking is to think about an ecosystem. And if you think about, say, a forest, you've got all sorts of different components: soil, plants, animals, all that life, and they all have an interconnected nature to them, and that comes from various ideas in biology as well. But working with families has really been sort of my focus for many, many years. And I've noticed over my time working in and with organizations that there's a real similarity between how family systems operate and how organizational systems operate. So when we start to think about relationships in the workplace, it makes sense to start to think about the way that every part of an organization interacts with another. And it's an area that doesn't often get looked at, I don't think, completely. So we have systemic thinking in working with organizations, but not necessarily using it as a way of enhancing the relationships.
And I can definitely see that, because I suppose things like culture and things would come into it, and all these things where you tweak one thing in an organization and it's just not straightforward, is it? Everything is interconnected, like a set of cogs. So I can see how that links. Just from a pure curiosity point of view, in terms of before we go into organisational, which is much more relevant to this audience, but the sort of systemic psychotherapy piece, would you be talking about that if you were doing that with an individual psychotherapy? Is that talking about thinking about your whole body as a system then, or is it about external to that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a little bit of both. A big part of being part of a system is knowing yourself and having self-awareness. We could call that emotional intelligence. We might consider that as relational intelligence, both of which have a really important role to play when we're thinking about working as part of a team. So yes, I think it becomes about how you recognize what's happening within you at any given point in time, and that might be linked to your experiences over the length of your life, whether that's with the family or whether that's with friends or any social construct, whether that's educational system or religious. It all sort of fits together in terms of how we make sense of ourselves.
Yes, I can definitely see that. So obviously focusing in on what we feel is most relevant for this audience is how this relates to leadership. And also, I know you've got a model, you've coined a model, haven't you, that helps organizations to use this as a concept. Do you want to take me through that?
So I've created a model. It's called the 5x5 model, and it's really about how can we address dysfunction that might exist in any team or organization, what we see with dysfunction. Um, have you heard of Patrick Lenciosi's Five Dysfunctions of a Team? Yes, so
Yes,
that's really
it's a good book. Yeah.
yeah, it's the origin really of my approach in the sense that there's five dysfunctions, which are absence of trust, fear of conflict, lack of commitment, avoidance of accountability, and inattention to results. And these are big problems that often aren't really addressed or noticed, but they're there. Where I've introduced a new way of working is to balance those five dysfunctions with five essential team functions. And this is born from my work with teams and organizations. So the five essential team functions are an intentional culture, psychological safety, team alignment, defined team structure, and collaborative goal setting. So the 5 by 5 model is a framework, a way of discussing as a team, how are we doing, where do we need to improve. It's an approach, which means you can put it into practice, but it's also a process that really draws on working together and building stronger working relationships within a team and within an organization so that you can start to set forth a culture that supports high performance. And that's really where it comes into its own is that by going through these processes, by thinking together, by talking together about where you are along each of these axes or these domains, you start to find that you're working on the culture of the organization, which can really lead to a really dynamic process that emerges with teams.
And I like the fact that you've because the five dysfunctions of a team, it's so what you haven't done is just flip them, if you see what I mean. What you've come up with is a sort of as I say, a working process that you can work through to develop the team, presumably, and therefore avoid the dysfunctions.
Yes, yes. And, it was really interesting because I'd developed these ideas. I'd almost done a QI process on my approach and was deconstructing it. And I came out with these five essential team functions. And I'd read Patrick Lenciosi's book years before.
Yeah.
And as I was just reading through them, and I'd done a webinar, I'd presented these ideas, but it wasn't the 5 by 5 as it was just these five areas. And I realized that each of them actually offered a balance to the five dysfunctions, which is really where that's come from, is that recognition that actually these processes do provide that balance. It's not just flipping it, as you say, it's much more than that.
But also they're active as well, aren't they? They're things that
Mm,
you can actually do. So you can set an intentional culture. You can obviously do goal setting. So they're proactive things that you can do as a team and as leaders, I
absolutely.
guess. In terms of when you use this within organizations, um, how do you what is it like in practice? Do you sort of coach them through one at a time or share the model, or what's happens for people?
Well, it depends on what you're looking for. So not all teams or organizations are going to necessarily want to take time to do training. Although when a whole team goes through the process, it's really a catalyst for dynamic conversations and real connectedness that you can really start to see relationships move together. But coaching it is equally as impactful. I can talk to senior leaders or clinical leads or whoever is sort of interested in how can they introduce change into an organization, transformational change. So in terms of HR, it becomes a way of addressing many of the things that might be happening throughout the organization. So coaching would be, up to 6 sessions or more, depending, but to go through the model, to understand the techniques and the processes involved in doing that. So there's also, it's largely team based. So what we want to do is we want to try to get whole teams together to do thinking,
Yeah,
because if you're not aligned towards a shared purpose, then you're unlikely to be able to deliver your goals. And if we're also thinking about some of the processes that happen in teams, as I said, like many families, we will have different processes that can sometimes get in the way of how we work together. So we sometimes have to define our structure so that not only are we addressing team dynamics, but we're also introducing agility and flexibility, because sometimes it requires it.
yeah,
So we have to be able to think of it together. Now, if one person is introducing that change themselves, knowing the ideas and knowing the principles behind it means anyone can lead it. It's just a question of understanding it and being able to apply it. So the coaching can help you to do that. The training is more about the whole system or the team involved, or teams. If you were thinking, well, gosh, let's get everyone involved, but obviously there's time implication for that as well.
And when you're talking about this 5 by 5, do you kind of map? I'm visualizing a box. Do you map it onto Patrick Lencioni's, or is it just that it doesn't?
Yeah, well, yeah. So if we think about absence of trust, really what we're talking about is psychological safety or a lack of psychological safety. So those two fit together. If we're thinking about a fear of conflict, then we're probably also talking about psychological safety, because we really need to be able to speak openly and challenge each other, and to do it in a way that means that it doesn't get shot down, or processes don't become sort of go under the surface. By doing that, we create an intentional culture of psychological safety. But psychological safety isn't just, hey, let's have an idea, let's just be psychologically safe. It's a whole process. And a lot of that is underpinned by attachment ideas. So we think about a secure base, that the workplace has to feel secure. We can't take risks in our work, in our lives, if we don't feel like we can be vulnerable in our relationships, but to do that safely. So we have to build that. Now, you can't always just build that just by wishing it to be so. It's a process. So you might start that by focusing on team alignment, and how do we work together? What are the things that we wish to really behold? What behaviors do we want to model, so that we can then develop that psychological safety? But doing that creates an intentional culture. So you start to see that this is a multimodal process, in the sense that working on one particular area enhances all the other areas as well. So it doesn't really matter where you start. You will start working through the model just by focusing in one domain. In terms of addressing those dysfunctions, it's not so much about saying, hey, look, there's a lack of commitment here, what are we going to do about that? Because there's a lack of psychological safety that there's. So it's really about working through the 5 essential team functions, and what you see are those problems that might be those dysfunctions start to shift and move on.
And actually, you mentioned this term multimodal then. So that is basically saying that there's a knock on, or it's impacting in multiple places at the same time.
Yeah, so it's impacting in multiple places at the same time. So by strengthening one area, you're positively impacting all of the others simultaneously.
A positive knock on, as opposed to the converse. Whereas if you damage one area, it damages other areas. So it is exactly the opposite of negative things, isn't it?
Yeah, and part of systemic thinking is about circularity and interconnectedness. So the model represents and actually is embedding that whole process of interconnectedness by change. And this can really lead to transformational change across an organization, because you start to have a language that starts to shape how you communicate and understand things together, which inevitably drives a focus towards commonality.
Definitely. And I can definitely see how it's got to be an inclusive process. It's not something you can decide in an ivory tower and say, work, this is the way it's going to be. You've got to get people to talk about it, to become self-aware, to own it.
Absolutely.
To life, haven't you? That makes a lot of sense. And I suppose, so I guess that's one of my questions, actually, how to bring it to life, getting people to own it. But if you've got listeners out there, or listeners to this podcast, who want to do some of this in their organizations or bring it to life, what tips have you got, or what steps could they take?
Well, I think the first really starting point would be to consider whether or not there is an openness to introducing difference. I think oftentimes we can get fixated or too focused on performance, and it has to be, we have to do this and we have to do that. It becomes task and transactional in a way. I think the starting point is thinking, can we improve? And, it's like, okay, yes, we can improve. Okay, what do we need to be able to improve? Well, one of the things that gets lost when everything gets really busy or really stressful is reflecting space or thinking time. So there's so many teams that won't even have the opportunity just to stop and take stock and think about, how are we doing? Are we doing well? That's probably the bit that is the starting point for anyone, is think, can we improve? And if so, how do we do that if we're not talking together? Once
Yes.
you start that, I think then you can move into exploration of, okay, well, what would we like to do differently?
So would you say that's one of the things that an HR leader might do, is to just encourage that sort of reflective space to actually ask those questions, how can we improve, or what would you like to do differently, or what or would you say hand that over to people? What would be the best way to sort of put this into action?
Well, I think in a way it's about attentiveness to what's happening within each team or within the organization as a whole, and just paying attention to areas that might be maybe symptomatic of a bigger problem. So if you have, for example, your attrition rates are quite high and there's a lot of turnover, that might be indicative of something not being quite right. Or if you feel that there's a lot of absenteeism or staff sickness or lots of burnout rates, that you have to start thinking, well, why is that? We can't just carry on that way. Presenteeism or quiet quitting, that's a big issue as well, where people just come to work and they're not really engaged. The question then becomes about, why is this the case and how do we start to explore that? So I think opening up those conversations. Are we, is there something that we're not aware of that's stopping people from really enjoying work? Is there something that is getting in the way? Now, HR leaders, I think, can probably take a focus or a lead on that, especially if some of these symptoms are present. It may be that then becomes their focus point. What's going on in this team or in this particular department that might mean that something isn't quite working effectively. And I always start from a strength-based position. Because if we start to focus too much on the problems and we become really problem saturated, it's very difficult to see any light at the end of the tunnel. So thinking about, what are we doing well now? And I suppose this might take the form of appreciative inquiry approach, where you're starting
Yeah.
to think a little bit more about, what do we know that we're doing well and what would we like to get to? That's usually a really good catalyst for starting to think about, where could we be better?
And again, it's this whole positive approach to it, like appreciative inquiry, which I like there. And getting people just to reflect, to think about what it is, because you can always tweak something or adjust something. And again, you're getting the ownership by doing it this way, aren't you? In terms of if I wanted to actually, I guess, uh, involve others in this, or would you say there's a natural starting point? Because we talked about leadership at the start, and I can see how this, of course, does
Mm.
link to leadership. Your point that everything does link. I think about where there are issues. You talked about people not being engaged, and quite often the root of it may come down to a behavior of a leader or a manager or someone in the organization who is or isn't on board with it. So I can see how that links in. How would you get people to, or HR, to introduce this to people, or to leaders in an organization?
Um, that's a good question. I think introducing it into the organization is uh, really about thinking together. I'm sorry, I've just lost my train of thought.
Well, I suppose I was thinking, if I was going to introduce it into the organization, would I do it? I was thinking, would it go with something like, I've done training on the five dysfunctions, for example. Would you get them to talk about the five dysfunctions and get conversing about them, a bit like you do the coaching, I suppose? Do you talk about the dysfunctions, or do you talk about your positive indicators, or do you do both?
I
Um,
think it's both. So we need to be able to name any problems. So if we don't really name that there's dysfunction, and dysfunction doesn't have to mean dysfunctional, I think that's a really important point, because we can immediately think, oh, well, that's dysfunction. That must mean that it's an impossible problem to resolve. It doesn't. It just means it's indicative of something not working effectively, or as effectively as it could. So we have to name it. And but I think timing is a big part of it, which is where the model really does take effect. So I might say that the best starting point for any team or any organization or leader who's interested in doing this is to start focusing on team alignment. Now, the way that you might start that is by thinking about what do I know about me and who I am? And you might start going through, what are my values? What are my beliefs? What's important to me? How do I respond in difficult situations? What are my strengths, my weaknesses? What are my limitations? And really getting to know oneself. Now, that could easily be just a task. Hey, everyone, just sit down, go through these questions and just give some thought to it. So that's really important because if I don't know me, there's no way that you're going to know me. And I think what we find is we can interact with our colleagues in a really superficial way. I might know what you've done this weekend, or I might know where you're going on holiday, or what sports teams you support, but I might not actually know what's really going on. And I suppose we're getting into health and well-being as well in this space. But once we do that, then it's, I now know me, now you know you, but we have to come together. And I call this sort of a knowing me, knowing you exercise, where the process is very much about how do we start to share who we are with each other, because that builds a stronger relationship just in the nature of creating awareness of each other. You start to shape a team identity in a way that you would never do in any other way. I remember I was working with a team and I just asked them to say something about themselves that no one in the team knew.
Yeah.
And we had band members, we had jewelry makers, we had sports people, cricket players, and no one knew this. And you could just see the team come to life just by exploring, understanding. Like, I had no idea you did that. That's so cool. And it just changed the way that they interacted in that very brief moment. So that's a good starting point. Getting teams to start to really connect with each other, just to know each other, because you spend 8+ hours a day working with your colleagues. That's a long time not to really know each other very well.
That's very, it reminds me of a model that I haven't seen for many years, the Johari window. Do you remember that whole sort of
Yes.
visibility? What I think is really appropriate about that exercise, picking that one, I think that anyone could do that, is that right now, if you are working remotely or hybrid working, you don't have those instances to the same degree as you did when everybody was in the office 5 days a week, to have those informal conversations. You jump on and the niceties are really quick, and you kind of get down to business much more, I think. So therefore maybe one of those things is building trust, knowing people directly, just building that relationship and rapport is going to strengthen the relationships. And I think that's probably needed more with this way of working than it, at least as much, if not more, than it was needed in the past.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the difficulties with hybrid working or working remotely is 35% of communication is nonverbal. So how do I really know what's going on underneath the surface if all I really see is your face and I don't really pick up on the emotional processes that might be happening? I could pick that up in a room, 100%. You'll feel tension if there's tension, but you don't necessarily get that over a computer screen.
Yeah.
So taking the time to do, and you can do any number of different games. I've done games with 30 or 40 people online where we just being playful, and that playfulness can lead to some really interesting thoughts and conversations about why did you choose that over this, and why what does this say about who we are. Taking the time to do that will pay off in dividends 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So, Matthew, if people wanted to know more about this or to get in touch with you personally to understand more about how to bring this to life in their organisation, how can they get hold of you?
Well, I'm available on LinkedIn, so they can find me on LinkedIn. They can look at two websites. One is called the 5x5 model, so it's www.the5x5model.com. And
Is
then
that five
there's
spelled out or with a letter,
yes,
with a
it's
number?
just the five is the number,
Yeah.
and it's 5x5. So that's an important distinction to make.
We'll put these in the show notes if anyone's lost.
Yeah, and then they've got my website, which is www.systemicsolutionsconsulting.co.uk, and so one is my consultancy offer, and the other is more about the approach and the model.
Perfect. That's great. So I'll get the links off you and we'll put them in the show notes so people want to go and just click directly on them from hruprising.com. But Matthew, thank you so much for coming on the HR Uprising.
Thanks for having me, Lucinda. It's been great.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.
This episode was brought to you by Disruptive Media, helping bold entrepreneurs stand out through podcasting, video, and social content. Visit disruptivemedia.co.uk to learn more.